Hello and welcome to Religion and Life. I'm your host, Ozzy Ostwald. AI, artificial intelligence. There's been a lot of discussion lately about AI and the future. Pundits wonder aloud about AI. Will artificial intelligence represent the next big step in evolution of consciousness? Or will AI destroy human civilization? Or neither? My guest today, Dr. Randall Reed, and his students, Percy Aargon and Avery Hefner, have been experimenting with AI and none other than Jesus. Thank you. I don't think I got your names quite right. It's Aargon, right? I'm sorry about that. But I appreciate you all joining us today. This is wonderful. Dr. Reed's been on the show several times before, and I am so excited to talk to you about this project that you're involved with. So maybe you can just briefly introduce yourselves, and then I want to hear about how you conceptualize this project with artificial intelligence and Jesus and what we can learn from it. So Dr. Reed, you start.
So I'm Randy Reed, and I'm a professor in religious studies. I'm a sociologist of religion, and these days my focus is on religion and technology, and specifically on artificial intelligence and religion. And this project is one of a couple that I'm involved in and heading up in order to sort of try to see what kind of intersections we can have between AI and religion.
Yeah. And you're really smart because you get these wonderful students to do all your work for you. But Percy, would you mind introducing yourself, please?
Yes, I'm Percy Aargon, and I'm a religious studies major. I'm also a psychology major. I recently added on the religious studies just because I kept taking religious studies courses. Things were very interesting for a long time, and I kept adding on credits for it. I've been involved with this project since its conception, since spring of 2020, which has been a while for me. That's been my whole academic career.
Great. You've been involved with it since the inception, really.
Mm-hmm.
That's great. Yeah, good.
Percy's a lifer.
A lifer, okay. And Avery?
Yep, so I'm Avery Hefner. This is actually my second semester here at App State. So I've been working with Dr. Reed and Percy here for 2 semesters now with Digital Jesus. Dr. Reed recruited me right as I was applying to App State with a religious studies major. So been doing religious studies classes and really getting into it and having a good time with it and learning a lot about Digital Jesus.
I'm really happy that both of you are involved in this project. So, Randy, tell us about this project with artificial intelligence and Digital Jesus in layperson's terms, that I can understand. What is it? How does it work? And what are you finding here?
So what we were trying to do is we were trying to basically see what would happen if you took an AI and you basically focused its attention on the sayings of Jesus, mm-hmm. right? And so basically what we did is we took the AI that OpenAI has created, that most people probably know as ChatGPT, mm-hmm. And we had it read 29,000 verses from multiple versions of the Bible, right? So
these were all just sayings of Jesus.
Just sayings
of
Jesus.
All right. Okay.
After it had done that, it had then we kind of wanted to see what had it absorbed, right? How had it changed from being sort of forced to confront the sayings of Jesus, and what kind of AI would it become from doing that? And of course, the interesting thing is it's not a tabula rasa. It doesn't start from nothing, right? It already knew English. It already had absorbed our culture from all the texts it had been trained on before it got to us. So it had read Wikipedia and most of the internet and Gutenberg Bibles and archives and all kinds of things. I mean, it had taken in something like a trillion words.
Right.
And so it already had a kind of sense of the culture. So what the Digital Jesus Project did then was take that kind of modernist perspective that it already had, and then force it to confront the sayings of Jesus and see what we get. Yeah. And our thought was that what we might end up with was a Jesus that actually would have something that was really directly relevant to say to our time. All right, because it would know. I mean, unlike the Jesus of history, wouldn't know what a cell phone is, or wouldn't have had contact with the internet, or democracy was not really a notion that he would have been confronted. The social safety net. I mean, a lot of the things that are just part of our culture were not part of antiquity, and so digital Jesus actually has all that background, and then has absorbed the sayings of Jesus.
So this artificial intelligence, given the cultural background now, absorbing the sayings of Jesus, is the goal for it to be able to respond to relevant questions to our time, but respond the way Jesus would respond? That's the goal. All right.
That's what we would. That's what we hope.
That's fascinating, right?
Right.
Okay.
And really, my vision of AI, my understanding of what AI is oftentimes it's a mirror of our culture. When you ask it questions, it reflects back to us what our culture says in an interesting and often unusual way, because it doesn't think quite the way we think. Right? It's an artificial intelligence. It's not a human intelligence.
Right.
So in some ways, it's kind of an alien intelligence. So what happens to that intelligence when it has to deal with the sayings of Jesus?
Yeah. So, Percy, did you get to ask digital Jesus questions of your own, or what was your role here? Were you helping to construct questions along the way, or?
Well, my role has been reading the Bible many, many, many times in the past 2 years.
29,000 verses? No, probably not that many, right?
I feel like I know the Bible very well.
Yeah.
But then it was also compiling a list of questions that various classmates and professors wanted to ask Jesus. Like I and several other people involved in the project in past semesters opened up the question to our classes of, if you could ask Jesus anything, what would you ask? And that was filed down into 5 categories of questions, more or less. It was something theological, scriptural, unrelated, general, or life advice.
Right.
With good examples of those being, do you believe in aliens? And then also, what would you do if it's your last day on Earth?
That would be. I want to hear about that response. Maybe a little later on. That's a pretty open-ended question, right? So you collected these questions from faculty and students in the department, or was it broader cast than that?
It was in my psychology classes as well as in religious
Yeah.
studies, because that's what I was in at the time.
Yeah, it's interesting because sometimes I hear people say, "I wish I could ask Jesus this question," or "I wish I could ask God this question." You guys are actually doing it. So, Avery, what was the most surprising question that came across your consciousness?
Mainly the differences between, I think, like with denominations and their view of Jesus. It was interesting because when we did the actual coding of Jesus, which was going through the responses that he gave us and then determining what they sounded like versus a criteria that we had for them, we could label his responses with either evangelical or maybe sometimes was more like a traditional church response. It all depended, and we got a large variety of responses from him that didn't say like one specific denomination or one specific belief system. It really seemed very varied and open.
But you were able to recognize when Jesus was answering more like a modern day evangelical would answer as opposed to a Unitarian, maybe?
Definitely.
Based on the quality of the answers or the perspective of the answers. So that raises a question for me, and any of you can respond, but with AI in general, how do you control for things like bias, or do you? Is bias just going to be inevitable as part of the programming model? And maybe another way to put this is, how do you trust digital Jesus to give us a Jesus-like answer?
Well, that was really the question: is would it give us a Jesus-like answer? Right? And one of the things that we did is we did a kind of comparison. So if you one of the things that ChatGPT can do is it can basically imitate people. So if you ask it to pretend it's the Dalai Lama, or you ask it to pretend it's Martin Luther King, it will sound like the Dalai Lama or Martin Luther King. And so we started there. We said, okay, pretend you're Jesus. And then we asked it this series, there were 90 questions that we came up with,
91.
and they were 91.
91.
and they were questions that were, what is the greatest commandment, or which is better, Kirk or Picard, right? And the whole variety of different kinds of questions that we asked, some of them political, some of them social, some of them cultural. And then we asked sort of ChatGPT, pretend you're Jesus, and then we took all those kind of answers. And what we found was that ChatGPT was very open-minded. It was kind of a good Unitarian, right? it wanted everybody to love each other, but it didn't really have hard and fast perspectives. It would say, well, some people think this, some people think that. You got to decide for yourself what you want.
I'm not sure that sounds like Jesus in the Gospels. Right?
No, that's exactly right.
Right, yeah.
But when we then trained that same AI on the sayings of Jesus, what we got was something very different. It was very definitive, right? It knew exactly what you should do. It was very much more dogmatic. It was like, you listen to me and you follow me, and that's what I expect out of you. Not this on the one hand and then on the other hand thing that we got from sort of ChatGPT. So it really, when it was confronted with all these verses, it really sort of changed its perspective and sounded a lot more like the Jesus that we have in the Gospels.
So AI learns.
That's right.
All right. So the digital Jesus you created sounds more like what we would expect to hear from the Gospel. So that so Percy, let me ask you this: so when you ask digital Jesus, what is the greatest commandment? Right? Did you get the answer you expected? Did you get the answer that we have in the Gospels themselves?
Yes, we did. That was one of our checks and balances for it, was asking these scriptural questions that Jesus was asked in Scripture, and seeing, does it give the same response or similar responses, which it did. It said, love in God.
All right, so that tells us that digital Jesus can learn what's there and knows how to respond when given something that is known. And I guess the next big leap is then to ask it a question that wouldn't have been in the Gospels, right? And that's where it really starts to get interesting to me. Avery, can you think of a question that wouldn't have been in the sayings of Jesus that you made up? And
we asked Jesus a lot of questions that were related to like modern day cultural questions, things about sexuality, things about politics, stuff like that. And it was interesting seeing it try to explain its opinions on those things through a biblical lens and through the sayings of Jesus.
Yeah. So did you ask it, just out of curiosity, did you ask digital Jesus' opinion about same-sex marriage or same-sex attraction or other LGBTQ issues?
We did. That was one that we actually rephrased in 3 different ways to see if the phrasing would matter. Asked it, do you think gay people should get married? Do you think gay people deserve to get married? And then what is your opinion on sexuality, or what is the immoral sexuality? Mm-hmm. It was pretty interesting asking that last question because it was so focused on adultery, which I had completely forgotten was a major sticking point. Mm-hmm. I'm so focused around gay things that I forgot adultery is also immoral. And
particularly
Jesus,
in the Jewish context of the sayings of Jesus.
Yeah.
Yes.
And Jesus says, like, love each other, but don't have adultery. Don't go off with another man's wife. Don't go off with another person's spouse.
So that adultery then became the kind of leading moral question when it came to sexuality.
Yeah, for digital Jesus, when you ask it what constitutes sexual immorality, it's not really interested in the things that are part of the culture wars for us today.
Right.
It's really focused on this question about adultery because for Jesus that was the issue, and the question about that you see in the Gospels about divorce, and the caveat that But maybe in some Gospels that say, but if adultery is involved, then it's a different situation. So for digital Jesus, adultery becomes the sort of marker of what constitutes sexual immorality. And when we asked it about homosexuality, and we asked it about gay marriage and those issues, it actually tended to waffle. Sometimes it would give us very clear answers. Like we would ask the question 3 different times to see if it would change its answer. And with the question of homosexuality or gay marriage, it almost always did. It gave us one where it said no, one where it said yes, and one where it said I'm not sure. So it at some level, having read the Gospels in multiple translation, it wasn't able to come to a clear understanding of what was right and what was wrong in those things. It had a whole bunch of things sort of going on in the background, and it couldn't really decide. The one place that wasn't true in terms of politics was in separation of church and state. It was strongly for the separation of church and state.
Well, that's interesting.
Yeah. But in terms of abortion or in terms of homosexuality, neither of those, the answers that we got on either of those questions, either were just all over the map or just didn't make any sense.
So would digital, and I know that we're looking ahead to what AI might become, but do you envision ever a time where digital Jesus would be able to take its own perspective about adultery and say the main thing with sexuality is fidelity, and it doesn't really matter who you marry as long as you're faithful within the relationship? Because it seems to me that would be a step further, right? That digital Jesus would be able to reason from its own perspective about marriage, adultery, and fidelity, and then apply it in a different situation. Is that something on the horizon you see, Avery, perhaps?
I mean, Avery has actually been working on this question of metacognition and getting it to think through some of these things.
Yeah, I think especially with the prompting that we use, we've told him, like, think through this step by step. I think we could use prompting saying, like, knowing what we know now, or knowing what we know in the cultural sphere now, what would your opinion be on this, or how would it change knowing this piece of news or this law that we have?
That's interesting. Do you? I know you didn't train digital Jesus on the Pauline writings, but just while we're on the matter of sexuality, do you think that digital Jesus absorbed any of Paul as part of that larger cultural context, and did that show up in his response? I see you shaking your head, so apparently there must be some evidence for that.
Yeah, there's actually a little piece of a Pauline quote that we found in one of digital Jesus's responses. I think it had to do with sexuality, but maybe I'm wrong about that. Do you remember?
I don't remember.
Yeah.
So the AI picked that out of the larger cultural
That's right.
context, not what you fed it.
That's right.
Yeah. That's pretty fascinating.
That was actually a kind of consistent issue with, not an issue, but it came up repeatedly when we were coding the responses, is wondering, is this from the internet? Because it sounds very Johannine. This is very John-focused gospel thinking. And that's kind of what the internet thinks about most, is how John's Jesus is. Mm-hmm. And we started questioning, well, is there a spin on Jesus that is coming out more, because that's what the internet talks about the most?
So the internet focuses on the Johannine Jesus. That's interesting in and of itself.
Right, because I mean, every football game you see, right? You see John 3:16 as a banner behind it, right?
Yeah.
And so the Johannine Jesus has really sort of become sort of the Jesus particularly through evangelicalism. Right? Evangelicalism and the Orthodox movement is really inspired by Paul and John, mm-hmm. and so when with ChatGPT, that's kind of the vision of Jesus that it had. And so we were able to correct for that some when we said here's all of these other verses, and of course 3/4 of them are going to come from the synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke.
Right.
They're not going to come from John. But even still, even though that it's less than a quarter of the thing, it's only about 22% of the sayings that we gave it were from John. It still would resort to Johannine language more often than not.
That's really interesting. So you've been talking about the synoptic gospels and John's gospel, the 4 gospels in the official list of books, right, the canon. And we know that there are other books out there, non-canonical gospels and other sources that are also filled with sayings of Jesus that oftentimes are quite different from what we're accustomed to. Have you experimented with that at all? Have you fed digital Jesus the Gospel of Thomas, for example?
That's where we're going right now.
Okay.
We're trying to see if we can get a non-canonical digital Jesus, and both Avery and Percy have been working on that this semester. Talk a little bit about our progress there and some of the challenges we have.
I think Percy would mainly be the best to talk about the Gospel of Thomas, because Percy's worked with 5 different versions of the Gospel of Thomas.
Oh, yeah?
It's all of the versions that were available on one website archive. But the Gospel of Thomas is unique because it's just Jesus quotes almost entirely, which, yay, that's what we wanted.
Right.
But it's only about 100 quotes in totality, so there's not terribly much to go off of. But when working with the Gospel of Thomas, we've had some difficulties in getting it to respond akin to Gospel of Thomas, because there is so little to work with. It's not like we have 29,000 verses to go off of with that. There's only 5 translations that we have, and the way that we uploaded and processed the data into the AI this time was different from our past project, where it's focusing on just one version's data set. So either the Lambden or the, Robinson versions, and Davies version, different translations like that. But they've had different focuses for its answers. I've gotten many responses that were the exact same word for word when I run it 3, 4, 5, 6 times, because it comes up with the same context that it's quoting.
Right. And here's where that bias issue comes back, because ChatGPT is so biased by the Orthodox Gospels, right, the canonical Gospels, that when it's confronted with the sayings in the Gospel of Thomas, which has some overlap with the canonical Gospels, but oftentimes are very different, that it has a hard time giving us something that sounds more like Thomas. Take for instance this question of what's the greatest commandment. Right? Thomas doesn't really have this a saying like this, so digital Jesus will resort to the greatest commandment is love your God with all your heart and mind. Or take another example of the difference between love and light. In the Gospel of Thomas, the term love comes up very rarely, but light comes up constantly, right? But ChatGPT was so focused on Jesus as sort of the prophet of love that when we ask it the question of which is better, love or light, from the perspective of the Gospel of Thomas, it says definitely love. But that's not what Thomas says.
Right.
Light is what's most important in Thomas. He rarely talks about love in Thomas. And so it just doesn't seem to be able to get past that sort of bias that it's had from our sort of cultural understanding of who Jesus is.
Well, that makes sense, right? Particularly, if you got 29,000 verses as opposed to 100, then there would be a weighting difference here. I would be interested to ask digital Jesus questions after you fed him some from the infancy Gospel of Thomas, right? What were you thinking when you struck down your playmate? See how he responded.
And I think those, particularly something like that, where you have a story that seems sort of diametrically opposed to our cultural understanding of Jesus. It's really going to have a hard time taking that on and taking that perspective. I think and I think there's a larger message there, which is that there are these biases that often are also our biases that are hard to see until we try to do something that kind of contradicts those sorts of things, and so it will reflect back to us what it thinks we want to hear, and not necessarily the right answer. And this is a bigger problem in AI in general, is getting it to give answers that are right and not just what people want to hear.
Yeah. Well, it is a brave new world, and you guys are our future. So in the couple of minutes we have left, just tell me where do you see this going, Avery?
I think Digital Jesus would be great for almost like a biblical search engine. If you're ever having a discussion with a family member or a pastor, or even someone that's not religious but wants to know more about Jesus, it's a way to avoid the Bible says, or so-and-so says. It's a way to almost go straight to the source, because it's something that's literally trained on the sayings of Jesus, and then you can get that opinion from Digital Jesus, and it's much more true to source.
Yeah, and it would also, as a search engine, it can tell you what's there, and then as a kind of curiosity, it can tell you what Jesus might have to say about abortion or something like that. Yeah. So where do you see it going, Percy?
Well, I've done this several times with my friends and staff members, where we'll have a discussion going on, and I say, who would be great to bring into this conversation?
That's funny.
Jesus.
Yeah,
and then I whip out the computer and we start plugging in questions for him. It usually settles the debate.
Yeah.
Except for when he can't agree with himself, then the debate gets even worse.
Wow. Well, this is fascinating. I know artificial intelligence is something that's going to be important for us moving forward. We're going to see it affect every aspect of our lives, and I would imagine that we'll see it not only in religious studies, but in theology and in other areas akin to religion. So, Dr. Reed, thank you for this important research.
Thanks for inviting us.
Look forward to continuing to see what comes out of this. And Percy and Avery, thank you for working hard with Dr. Reed and representing our department so well.
Thank you for having us.
All right. Well, that's it for Religion and Life this week. I hope you join us again next week here on App TV as we continue to examine the relationship of society, religion, and culture. Until then, this is Ozzy Ostwald.